Hi everybody, it's Melissa from Welcome to the Woods. Today I'm going to show you how to apply polycrylic and polyurethane, basically any poly product. This is how I would go about doing it. So the first thing, I'm going to go through the materials we're going to need. You are going to need a tack cloth. A tack cloth is a very inexpensive sticky fabric thing that you can buy in the paint section of any hardware store, and it allows you to easily pick up all the dust and any debris that might mar your sealant finish. Then you're going to need a 200 grit or 300 grit sandpaper, and I got 220 grit. The fine finish sandpaper is going to be for before you put subsequent coats of poly on. So I wouldn't sand my paint job or my staining job. I'd put a layer of poly on and then I'd sand between. I'm going to use a foam roller instead of a polyester brush, but I have applied polycrylic with a polyester bristle brush. It's just harder to prevent brush strokes, so I like to use a fine roller. And then a tray to roll out your tools and, of course, your product. Now, I generally reach for polycrylic, and you can look at the differences between polyurethane and polycrylic in this video linked above and in the description below. Especially with a paint job, I would typically use polycrylic just because the cleanup process of soap and water is much easier. Alright, let's get started. I recently painted these stairs, and I did coats of polycrylic on before, but for the demonstration purposes, I'm going to pretend as if I was doing this freshly painted and brand new. So you're going to want to make sure that your paint job is dry, of course, fully before you start putting on poly layers. So the first thing is to run over it with the tack cloth, and it's also really important that you don't do this while you are like in windy conditions or dusty conditions. It's best to use poly products indoors because as with most sealants, it's very easy for things to get stuck to them. So after your tack cloth has picked up all of the dust and anything that might be in the way of the poly adhering, you're going to pour a little bit of poly into your tray, and you're going to roll out your foam roller. Now I like to roll it out significantly so there's not a ton of poly in my tool. Now we're going to apply, and if you're using a stained piece, you will apply the polycrylic with the wood grain. If you're using a painted piece, I just tend to use a cross-hatching motion like this to get very even coverage, especially if it's like a large surface area. With my stair railing here, there isn't a large surface area, so I'm just kind of rolling it straight, which is fine too. You want to make sure that you're not getting any poly dripping, which is why I also like to use a roller instead of a brush, because your coverage is very even and you can easily tell if you press the roller down too hard, it's going to leave a drip. So we're just going to get this all coated. And you can see that the roller puts down quite a bit of bubbles, but you get this same issue when you're using polycrylic with a brush. The bubbles are not going to be a problem once we roll over it in just a minute. Now you've gotten the polycrylic down, we're going to not load up our foam roller. This needs to be just totally leftover or even empty. And we're going to ever so lightly roll over this and pop all these bubbles. You don't want to press down at all. It's very important to let the tool pick up excess polycrylic here so that we don't have bubbles that dry in our finish. Now sometimes at this point, if I can still see where I rolled, I'll come the opposite direction and lightly pick up bubbles the other way. That really helps when you have a large surface area as well. You lightly roll all the polycrylic in one direction so you don't see your cross hatch marks from when you first applied it. Some of these tips are much more important for your final coat of poly than your previous coats, and you're going to usually want to apply 3 to 5 coats on whatever you're doing. But the good news is that it dries very quickly. You can apply a second coat after only about an hour. You don't absolutely need to obsess over bubbles or brush strokes the first how many coats until you get to your very last layer of poly. Then you want to use these tips that I'm saying to really get your finish to be smooth. The reason is because even if you have little bubbles or brush strokes, when your first poly layer dries, your second poly layer dries, etc., you're going to come in and lightly sand, and that is going to help take care of some things, and then you're going to do another coat of poly, which will fill in some of those bubbles that might have happened. So many of the problems that you can have when applying poly, if you're not happy with the finish, can be solved with more layers of poly. Okay, so after about an hour, your poly layer has dried and you're ready for the next coat. What you're going to do between coats is sand with that light grit sandpaper, like I mentioned before. And you can put this around a little block if you want to make it easier on yourself, or you can do it by hand. And again, if you're sanding something that's stained wood, you always go with the wood grain. If you're sanding something painted, it's not as noticeable which direction you sand. The sanding step is important to allow for proper adhesion of the polycrylic layers to each other. Now you're going to take your tack cloth and you're going to wipe up the residue, because little white dust will appear when you sand your poly layer. Okay, and then you just repeat the process again and again until you've built up however many coats you're going to do. So I'm going to come back in now with the poly. And for your last layer, you're not going to do the sanding step, of course, because the last layer is poly alone. Alright, so now you know how I like to apply poly products. If you have a method that's different than mine, I'd love to know what you do in the comments below. Or if you've tried my method and it worked well for you, I'd love to know that as well. Thank you guys so much for watching This or That DIY with Welcome to the Woods. I hope this video was helpful for you and that you'll consider subscribing to my channel to see more home DIY. See you later!